The world today, as of August 2025, is witnessing a profound and dangerous realignment of global power, one that is being fought not just with rhetoric and diplomacy, but through the arteries of the global economy, oil pipelines and tanker routes. At the heart of this struggle is a monumental standoff between the United States on one side and a deepening partnership between China and Russia on the other. This is not merely a dispute over barrels and dollars, it is a fundamental clash of worldviews, strategic interests, and economic models. The United States, seeking to cripple Russia's war machine in Ukraine and maintain its global leadership, is using its formidable economic leverage to choke off Moscow's energy revenues. This strategy, however, is running headlong into the non-negotiable national priorities of the world's rising powers. For China, the world's largest energy importer, this conflict is not an abstract geopolitical chess match but a matter of national survival. Its booming economy and vast population demand a constant, reliable, and affordable flow of energy. This has pushed Beijing into a strategic embrace with Russia, a pariah in the West but a vital energy lifeline for the East. China is purchasing massive quantities of discounted Russian oil, defying American sanctions and providing President Vladimir Putin with a critical economic safety net. This decision is not made lightly. It is a calculated move to secure its own future, insulate its economy from Western pressure, and assert its right to forge its own path on the world stage, independent of Washington's dictates and demands. This intricate dance of power places other major nations like India in an incredibly precarious position. As the world's third-largest oil consumer, India finds itself caught between its historical and strategic relationship with Russia, its growing partnership with the United States, and its own pressing domestic economic needs. Like China, India sees discounted Russian crude as a national compulsion, a necessary tool to manage inflation and fuel its growth. Yet, this has put New Delhi directly in the crosshairs of American economic pressure, threatening to unravel a carefully constructed diplomatic balance. The choices made in Washington, Beijing, and New Delhi will not only determine the price of oil, but will also shape the very architecture of global alliances for decades to come. What we are observing is the painful and chaotic birth of a new global order. The post-Cold War era, defined by American preeminence and a relatively integrated global economy, is giving way to a more fractured world. This new landscape is characterized by competing economic blocs, weaponized supply chains, and a relentless struggle for resources. The standoff over oil is the most visible front in this larger conflict, a clear indicator of how geopolitics is now driving economic policy. The decisions being made today carry immense consequences, setting the stage for a future that could be defined either by renewed cooperation or by escalating confrontation and instability across the globe. The United States has deployed its most powerful non-military weapon in its campaign against Russia: its economic might. The core of Washington's strategy is to make it as difficult and costly as possible for any nation to do business with Moscow, particularly in the energy sector, which serves as the lifeblood of the Russian state and its military efforts. President Trump's administration has adopted an aggressive posture, making it clear that it views the purchase of Russian oil as a direct subversion of Western policy. The primary tool in this campaign has been the threat and implementation of steep tariffs. This is economic statecraft at its most blunt, designed to force a stark choice upon nations: trade with the United States or trade with its adversaries. The message is simple and unwavering. This policy has been directed with particular intensity toward China and India, the two largest buyers of seaborne Russian crude. The Trump administration has explicitly threatened to impose a staggering 100% tariff on all Chinese goods if Beijing refuses to cease its energy imports from both Russia and Iran. This is not a minor adjustment in trade policy, it is a declaration of economic war, designed to inflict maximum pain and compel a change in behavior. For India, the pressure has been similarly overt. Following a 25% tariff imposed in July 2024, President Trump announced on August 4, 2025, his intention to substantially raise these duties, citing India's buying massive amounts of Russian oil as the direct cause for this punitive action. Beyond the executive actions of the White House, there is significant momentum within the U.S. Congress to codify this hardline stance into law, creating a more permanent and powerful framework for sanctions. A bipartisan bill, introduced by Senator Lindsey Graham and supported by an overwhelming majority of 84 senators, proposes to authorize tariffs of up to an astonishing 500% on Russia. Crucially, the legislation would also apply to any country that is found to be knowingly purchasing Russian energy products. While this bill is currently on hold, awaiting a signal from President Trump, its existence sends a powerful message to the world about the depth of American resolve and the potential for even more severe economic consequences for those who defy its sanctions regime. The goal of this multi-pronged approach is unambiguous: to create a global economic cordon around Russia, suffocating its main source of revenue, and thereby limiting its capacity to sustain its military operations in Ukraine. Washington policymakers believe that if they can cut off the flow of petrodollars to the Kremlin, they can alter the strategic calculus on the battlefield. However, this strategy carries significant risks. By wielding the hammer of tariffs so forcefully, the United States risks not just a trade war, but also the alienation of key partners it needs for its broader geopolitical strategy, potentially pushing nations closer to the very rivals it seeks to contain and isolate on the world stage. For the leaders in Beijing, energy security is not just one of many policy priorities, it is a foundational pillar of national stability, economic growth, and political legitimacy. As the world's factory, China's massive industrial base has an insatiable appetite for energy, and securing a steady, diverse, and affordable supply of oil and gas is paramount. This fundamental reality shapes nearly every aspect of its foreign policy, pushing it to forge relationships and make deals that often run counter to the preferences of the United States and its allies. The current global landscape, marked by sanctions and geopolitical volatility, has only intensified this long-standing imperative, making the pursuit of energy security more urgent and more central to China's strategic calculations than ever before. This relentless drive for energy has dramatically reshaped global oil flows, particularly since the escalation of the conflict in Ukraine in 2022. As Western nations moved to sanction and shun Russian energy, China saw both a strategic opportunity and an economic necessity. It stepped into the void, rapidly becoming Russia's single largest oil customer. By 2024, Chinese imports of Russian crude had reached record levels, with seaborne volumes in April of that year surging by 20% to over 1.3 million barrels per day. This was not a purely commercial transaction, it was a strategic decision to lock in a massive and reliable source of energy from a neighboring power that was suddenly isolated from its traditional markets in the West. A key driver of this burgeoning energy relationship is economics. China is able to purchase Russian and Iranian oil at significant discounts, what some analysts have called fire sale prices. These discounted barrels provide a dual benefit. Firstly, they help to lower China's massive energy import bill, giving its industries a competitive advantage and helping to manage domestic inflation. Secondly, by providing a ready market for sanctioned crude, China ensures that both Russia and Iran can maintain a steady stream of export revenue, thereby stabilizing their economies and undermining the effectiveness of Western sanctions. This creates a symbiotic relationship where China's energy needs are met on favorable terms, while its partners gain a crucial economic lifeline. This strategic calculus also extends to Iran. As of 2024, an estimated 80 to 90% of Iran's total oil exports, amounting to over 1 million barrels per day, were destined for China. This relationship provides Beijing with another major source of non-Western oil, further diversifying its supply away from regions where American influence is strong. However, this dependency is not without its own complexities. China's opposition to Iran's threat in June 2024 to close the Strait of Hormuz highlighted a critical vulnerability. Even as China builds relationships with sanctioned states, it remains reliant on the global maritime trade routes that the U.S. Navy helps to secure, illustrating the intricate and often contradictory nature of its quest for energy security. The deepening alliance between China and Russia is one of the most significant geopolitical developments of our time, and it is an alliance forged in the crucible of energy and necessity. From Beijing's perspective, Russia is the ideal energy partner. It is a geographic neighbor with vast world-class reserves of oil and gas, and most importantly, it is a major power that shares China's deep-seated skepticism of American global dominance. The war in Ukraine and the subsequent Western sanctions did not create this partnership, but they accelerated it dramatically, transforming it from a relationship of mutual interest into a quasi-alliance of strategic convenience. Russia needed new markets for its energy, and China needed new, secure sources of supply. This partnership is built on a foundation of tangible infrastructure and long-term agreements that predate the current crisis. The Power of Siberia gas pipeline and the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean oil pipeline are concrete manifestations of a long-term vision to physically link the Russian resource base with Chinese demand centers. These overland routes are of immense strategic value to Beijing because they are immune to the maritime choke points, such as the Strait of Malacca or the Strait of Hormuz, that could be controlled or disrupted by the US Navy in a potential conflict. This overland access provides a layer of energy security that tanker shipments from the Middle East or Africa simply cannot match, reducing China's vulnerability to American naval power. The economic logic of the alliance is just as compelling as the strategic one. For Russia, selling oil and gas to China provides a critical revenue stream that helps to offset the loss of its lucrative European markets. While it must offer substantial discounts to entice Chinese buyers, this revenue is nonetheless essential for funding its government, stabilizing its currency, and sustaining its war effort. For China, these discounted prices are a massive economic boon, lowering the cost of a key industrial input and helping to keep consumer prices stable. This arrangement allows both countries to achieve core objectives while simultaneously weakening the impact of Western economic sanctions, a shared goal that further cements their alignment. However, it would be a mistake to view this as an alliance of equals or one based on deep trust. It is at its core a pragmatic and transactional relationship driven by a convergence of interests against a common adversary, the United States. China holds the upper hand as the dominant buyer, able to dictate terms and leverage Russia's desperation for markets. Russia, in turn, is wary of becoming overly dependent on a single customer. Yet, for now, their shared desire to build a multipolar world order, free from what they see as American hegemony, outweighs any underlying friction. Their energy partnership is the engine of this broader strategic project, providing the economic fuel for their challenge to the existing global system. China's response to American pressure has been unequivocal, consistent, and honestly, pretty defiant. Beijing sees the United States' demands to halt Russian and Iranian oil imports not as a legitimate application of international norms, but rather as an infringement on its national sovereignty, and really as an attempt to dictate its foreign and economic policy. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has put this position out there very clearly, saying China will always ensure its energy supply in ways that serve our national interests. Coercion and pressuring will not achieve anything. And this statement is more than just diplomatic boilerplate. It actually reflects a core principle of China's worldview, that major powers have the right to pursue their own interests without interference from others, especially when it comes to something as critical as energy security. This stance is rooted in a deep-seated belief that the United States is using sanctions and tariffs as tools to contain China's rise and maintain its own global dominance. From Beijing's perspective, the American pressure isn't really about Ukraine or Iran's nuclear program. It's about using those crises as a pretext to slow down the Chinese economy and undermine its strategic partnerships. So, complying with U.S. demands would be seen as a strategic capitulation, an acknowledgement of American authority that China is no longer willing to make. By continuing to buy Russian and Iranian oil, China is sending a pretty clear message. It will not allow its trade policy to be held hostage to Washington's geopolitical agenda. Furthermore, China sees a pretty profound hypocrisy in the American position. Beijing often points out that many Western nations historically built their wealth and power on the very principles of sovereign trade and resource acquisition that they now seek to deny to others. Chinese officials and state media frequently frame the issue as one of principle, arguing that every country has the right to choose its own trading partners based on its national needs. They reject the idea of extraterritorial sanctions, where one country's domestic laws are applied to other sovereign nations, viewing it as, well, a relic of a colonial past and an unacceptable feature of the modern international system. This principled stand resonates strongly with other developing nations that are, frankly, also wary of American economic coercion. Ultimately, China's defiance is a calculated risk based on a cold assessment of its own power and leverage. It knows that the global economy is deeply intertwined, and that a full-blown trade war with 100% tariffs would be devastating, not just for China, but for the United States and really the entire world. Beijing is betting that the threat of such mutual destruction will limit how far Washington is willing to go. By standing firm, China not only secures its vital energy supplies but also positions itself as a leader of a bloc of nations resistant to American pressure, thereby advancing its long-term goal of building a more multipolar world where Washington's power is balanced by other major global players. Section 6. India's tightrope walk balancing old friends and new pressures. India finds itself in one of the most difficult diplomatic positions of any major power today, performing a delicate and high-stakes balancing act. On one side is its long-standing, steady and time-tested relationship with Russia, a legacy of the Cold War that continues to be a cornerstone of its defense and strategic policy. On the other side is its burgeoning strategic partnership with the United States, a relationship seen as vital for balancing China's growing influence in Asia. Now, this carefully managed equilibrium is being torn apart by the global standoff over oil. India's leadership must navigate between the immense pressure from Washington to isolate Moscow and its own undeniable economic and strategic imperatives that pull it in the opposite direction. The economic rationale for India's continued purchase of Russian oil is powerful and straightforward. Indian officials have described the decision not as a choice, but as a national compulsion. With Russian crude accounting for a significant 40% of its total imports, the discounted price, around $4 per barrel less than market rates, provides crucial relief to the Indian economy. This discount helps the government maintain stable domestic fuel prices for its 1.4 billion citizens, a critical factor for social stability, and it helps curb broader inflationary pressures. For a rapidly growing developing economy like India, access to affordable energy is not a luxury. It is the essential fuel for its continued progress and poverty reduction efforts. In response to U.S. tariff threats, which its foreign ministry has labeled unjustified and unreasonable, New Delhi has adopted a posture of firm defiance, vowing to take all necessary measures to safeguard its national interests. This is not mere rhetoric. India has a long and proud tradition of strategic autonomy, a foreign policy doctrine that resists alignment with any single power bloc. It sees the American demands as an encroachment on its sovereign right to make decisions based on its own national welfare. Furthermore, alienating Russia is not a viable option. Moscow remains a key supplier of advanced military hardware to India, and this defense relationship is seen as essential for its security, particularly given its tense borders with China and Pakistan. However, defying the United States carries substantial risks. The 25% tariff already in place, and the threat of more to come, could have a tangible impact on India's economic growth, with some estimates suggesting it could shave 0.2 percentage points off its 6.2% GDP growth forecast. While some economists, like those at Nomura, argue that India's low domestic inflation rate means it could theoretically withstand the pain of foregoing Russian oil, the political and strategic costs would be immense. The U.S. risks pushing a key partner in its Indo-Pacific strategy closer to the China-Russia axis, potentially undermining its own long-term goal of building a coalition to counterbalance Beijing's power in the region. Section 7. The Economic Fault Lines, a world splitting into rival blocs. The intense geopolitical friction over oil is acting as a powerful catalyst, accelerating the division of the world into distinct and competing economic blocs. The era of hyper-globalization, characterized by integrated supply chains and relatively free-flowing capital, is rapidly giving way to a new reality, defined by strategic competition and economic fragmentation. On one side, a bloc is coalescing around the United States and its traditional allies in Europe and Asia, who are increasingly using economic tools like sanctions, export controls, and investment screening to advance their shared security interests. This bloc seeks to enforce a rules-based order where economic relationships are conditioned on adherence to Western norms and geopolitical alignment. On the other side, a rival bloc is forming around the partnership of China and Russia, attracting other nations that are either subject to Western sanctions or are wary of American dominance. This group is actively working to build an alternative economic and financial architecture that is less dependent on the US dollar and Western-controlled institutions. The deepening energy ties between Russia, China, and Iran are the economic backbone of this emerging bloc. They are creating parallel trade systems, experimenting with payments in national currencies, and building infrastructure that physically connects their economies, all with the explicit goal of creating a self-sufficient ecosystem that is resilient to Western economic pressure and sanctions. This fracturing is not just about high-level politics, it is fundamentally reshaping the practical realities of global trade and investment. Companies are now forced to navigate a landscape where supply chains are no longer designed purely for efficiency, but for geopolitical resilience. The concept of friendshoring or ally shoring, relocating production and sourcing to politically aligned countries, is becoming a central feature of corporate strategy. This process is inherently inefficient and inflationary, as it often means moving away from the most cost-effective suppliers. The weaponization of trade through tariffs, as seen in the U.S. actions against China and India, forces nations and businesses to make stark choices about which economic ecosystem they belong to. The consequences of this division are profound. It risks unwinding decades of economic integration that lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It creates enormous uncertainty for businesses and investors, stifling long-term planning and investment. Moreover, it makes it far more difficult to address genuinely global challenges like climate change, pandemics, and nuclear proliferation, which require cooperation between all major powers. The world is moving from a model of complex interdependence where economic ties were thought to prevent conflict, to one of strategic decoupling where economic ties are seen as vulnerabilities to be minimized, setting a dangerous precedent for future international relations. Section 8. The ripple effect, shifting alliances and supply chain chaos. The consequences of this great power showdown over oil radiate far beyond the energy markets, creating powerful ripple effects that are reordering global alliances and throwing supply chains into a state of chaos. One of the most significant and perhaps unintended consequences of Washington's hardline policy is the risk of pushing its potential partners closer to its adversaries. The intense pressure on India, for example, threatens to undermine the very foundation of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, which hinges on cultivating India as a democratic counterweight to China. By forcing New Delhi to choose between its energy security and its relationship with Washington, the U.S. may inadvertently strengthen the case for greater cooperation among the BRICS nations and weaken the coalition it seeks to build. This dynamic is further complicated by other U.S. foreign policy moves. President Trump's outreach to Pakistan, a long-standing rival of India, to potentially develop its oil reserves adds another layer of complexity to the strategic calculus in New Delhi. Such moves can be perceived in India as a betrayal, or at the very least as a sign of American transactionalism, reinforcing the arguments of those who advocate for strategic autonomy and a diversified set of foreign partnerships. Instead of isolating Russia and China, this approach risks creating a broader front of resentful nations who feel targeted by American economic power, thereby making the China-Russia-led bloc a more attractive alternative for countries seeking to resist U.S. pressure. The disruption to supply chains is another major consequence. Before the recent conflicts, global energy flowed along well-established and economically efficient routes. Now, trade patterns are being redrawn along geopolitical lines. Russian oil that once went to Europe via short pipeline routes is now being shipped on long, expensive tanker journeys to Asia. In its place, Europe is importing oil from the Middle East and the United States, often at a higher cost. This massive rerouting of global energy flows is inefficient, increases shipping costs, raises insurance premiums, and adds a significant geopolitical risk premium to the price of every barrel of oil, contributing to global inflation. This chaos extends beyond oil. The broader trend of economic decoupling and the weaponization of trade are forcing a wholesale rethinking of global manufacturing and logistics. Companies are grappling with the immense challenge of building new, more resilient supply chains that are less vulnerable to sanctions and geopolitical shocks. This is a costly and time-consuming process that involves moving factories, finding new suppliers, and redesigning products. The result is a less efficient, more expensive, and more volatile global economic system. The smooth, just-in-time global supply chain of the past is being replaced by a fragmented, just-in-case model, a shift that will act as a persistent drag on global growth and prosperity for years to come. Section 9. Conclusion. The future of a fractured global order. We are standing at a critical juncture in modern history, where the global order is being fundamentally remade. The fierce competition over oil between the United States, China, and Russia is not a temporary crisis, but rather the leading edge of a new and more contentious era of great power rivalry. The choices being made today in the corridors of power in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow will have lasting consequences for global stability, economic prosperity, and the future balance of power. The era of a unipolar world, dominated by American economic and military might, and underpinned by a broadly integrated global economy, appears to be decisively over. We are now navigating the turbulent waters of a multipolar world, and the map is still being drawn. The immediate impact of this standoff is clear increased volatility in global oil prices and persistent inflationary pressures on the world economy. The inefficient rerouting of energy supplies, the risk premiums associated with sanctions, and the constant threat of escalating trade wars all contribute to higher costs for businesses and consumers alike. This creates a challenging environment for economic growth, particularly for developing nations that are most vulnerable to high energy prices. The dream of a seamlessly connected global marketplace is being replaced by the harsh reality of a world carved into strategic economic fortresses, where trade flows are dictated as much by political allegiance as by market logic. Looking ahead, the key question is whether this competition can be managed, or if it will spiral into open conflict. The risk of miscalculation is high. If the United States pushes its economic pressure too far, it could permanently alienate crucial partners like India and accelerate the creation of a powerful anti-American bloc. If China and Russia overplay their hand, they could provoke a more severe and unified Western response that cripples their economies. Navigating this new environment will require a level of sophisticated, nuanced statecraft that has been sorely lacking. It demands a recognition that while competition is inevitable, cooperation on existential global challenges remains essential for human survival. Ultimately, the future of this fractured global order depends on the ability of its leading powers to establish a new equilibrium. This will not be a return to the past, but an acceptance of a new reality, a world with multiple centers of power, each with its own legitimate interests and security concerns. Finding a way to manage these competing interests, to establish clear red lines and to maintain open channels of communication will be the great diplomatic challenge of the 21st century. The standoff over oil has exposed the deep fault lines in our global system. The task now is to prevent them from shattering it completely.